We're going to look at doing sunroof repair on the Audi 5000. Now, we're not going to cover the complete assembly and disassembly. Most of you are already pretty familiar with that. What we're going to cover is proven tips, tips that we've received from people like you, tips that will help us repair the sunroof right the first time. Now, there's a lot of information that exists on repairing the sunroof on the Audi 5000. It exists in places such as the Sunroof Update Book, the 5000 Update Book, Technical Management Guide, and, of course, the P circulars. Now, always make sure you refer to this information when you repair a sunroof. Let's start by taking a look at a kit that's available to update 1984 and some early 1985 models. The kit consists of 2 new sunroof cables, modified left and right guide channels, a new drive pinion for the cables, and a new washer for the drive pinion. Also, there's some seals. We have a new seal for the front guide channel cover, a new seal for the water drain tray, and last, a new seal for the sunroof panel itself. Now, it's important to realize that not all cars are going to need this sunroof kit installed during a sunroof repair. Some may have already had the kit installed during a previous repair, or some may have come from the factory with the latest parts already installed. Now, on these cars, remember, don't install the whole kit. Just replace the parts that are faulty.
The real question is, how do you tell whether the car you're working on has the early style or the late style parts installed? From February 1985, all cars will come equipped from the factory with the late style parts. If you're wondering about how you can tell on the car that you're working on, you'll need to slide back the sunroof panel and then tilt the roof. This will give you a good look at this guide. If this guide has the long ramp in it, as you see here, it indicates that it is the late style. The guide with the shorter ramp in it is the early style.
Before you begin reassembly of the roof, even if you're installing a kit, make sure you take the time to look at all the components of the roof to make sure there's nothing else that's worn or something that's dirty that needs to be cleaned.
One thing I always check is the front cable guide. That's the piece that keeps the 2 cables in mesh with the drive gear on the motor. One thing that can happen is that this front guide can actually spread here in the middle. When this happens, the cables can slip on the drive gear and causes the cables to go out of sync, and then the roof, of course, binds up. Take a look at this one. See how it's spread here in the middle? Whatever you do, don't try to squeeze it back into shape. Just replace it. Also, be sure that you don't leave this clip out when you reassemble the roof. Another thing that you should notice is that there are 2 different versions of this front guide available. One version does not replace the other. You've got to use the correct guide that goes with the particular car body that you're working on. Let's take a look at both of these versions. Notice how this version has the flat bottom and no reinforcing ribs here. This second version has a diamond in the bottom and has some reinforcement ribs. Remember, these pieces are not interchangeable, and whatever you do, don't cut off the reinforcing ribs to make it fit an early 85 or an 84 vehicle. Cutting off the ribs will only weaken the part. If you're not sure the right guide is in the car you're working on, look at the car body and make sure you use the front guide that matches the body. If there is a diamond cut in the body, as you see here, you'll have to use the front guide that has the diamond-shaped boss on it. If there is no diamond cut in the body, use the guide that has the flat bottom. And there's something else you have to be aware of. Cars that use the flat bottom guide have 3 spacer washers, one underneath each of the screws between the motor and the body. On this car, which has the diamond-shaped front guide plate, there is only 1 spacer washer.
Yeah, you're right, Jim. If you leave those washers out, that can cause real problems with the operation of the sunroof. But while we're talking about cable guides, we should also talk about the cables. The first thing you want to look at is to make sure that the cable teeth are not spread or damaged. If they are, replace the cable. Now there's two types of cables that we'll be dealing with. Later model cars produced after July 1986 will have this new cable with a steel end. This also is used in conjunction with a new cable channel. Now these are not interchangeable with the previous style or earlier style cable with the plastic end. And this is the cable that we'll be doing most of our repairs with. So let's take a close look at this because there's some things we should be aware of. The first one is to make sure that there's no burrs or flashing around here. Like see this flashing right here, we'd want to make sure we file that off. Also take a close look in the channel here, make sure there's no burrs or flashing in there because that could cause binding when we install it in the channel. The last thing you do is before installing it is to make sure that you lubricate this flocked area here with mineral oil. And once you get the cable installed in the assembly, you'll want to move it back and forth through its full travel. Make sure that it moves smoothly. The last time you move it, you want to move it from front to rear and line it up with your adjustment mark. Moving it from front to rear will ensure that there's no slack that exists within the cable itself. Now cables and guides and all that aren't the only thing that can make sunroofs bind. You want to look at your seals too. The first seal you want to check is the seal installed on the water drain tray. You want to make sure that it's installed so that the lip, the sealing lip, is facing towards the front of the vehicle. Next on the water drain tray, check the retaining levers to make sure that they aren't bent. The last seal that we'll want to check is this seal here going around the sunroof panel itself. If the seal should become swelled, the panel will then bind in the opening when you're moving the sunroof from the closed or open position. Now seals, cables, and cable guides are not the only thing that can cause a sunroof panel to bind.
That's absolutely right. Improperly tightening the front height adjustment screws will also cause the sunroof panel to bind. Be careful when you tighten the front height adjustment that you do not over-tighten this nut. This nut is for the reinforcement of the front sunroof support, not for securing the front height adjustment. Tighten the nut only until it contacts the support and then a half a turn more.
You're right, Jim, that is very important. Now before we finish, I'd like to share with you a couple other points that are important to ensure a successful sunroof repair. The first thing is during reassembly, make sure you use Loctite, preferably Loctite 326 on all the screws, especially this small fine adjustment screw here at the back of the guide channel. Second, when you're all finished your reassembly, spray these guide channels here with this special silicone lubricant that you can get from the parts department. Incidentally, this is a recommended procedure now for every 15,000 mile maintenance.
Remember, install the sunroof update kit if necessary. Inspect the front cable guide for spreading. Inspect the cables before installation, especially the ones with the plastic ends. Look at the sunroof seals. Make sure they are positioned correctly and not swollen. Loctite all screws and lubricate the guides with the special silicone spray.
Now I hope you'll use these tips. I think you'll find that they'll help you fix your customer's sunroof right the first time and also ensure reliable operation of it thereafter. Say, Jim, did they teach you anything on this new CISE-3 system at that service training school you just went to?
Yeah, we went through the fault memory.
Oh, it's got a fault memory?
Yeah, just like the turbo. Only this one gathers information on the inputs from the ignition system and the fuel system. And then, of course, it also does the output test, just like the turbo does.
Oh, that sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, why don't you climb in and we'll go through it.
All right, okay.
Now, one thing you need to remember is, of course, just like the turbo, you have to go through a road test. And you should road test the car for at least 5 minutes.
Is that to make sure that the fault memory has stored all the system's inputs?
That's exactly right. Make sure you hit full throttle once at least during the road test as well. And then when you get back in, don't shut the ignition off.
Oh, will that erase the memory just like on turbo engines?
Exactly right.
Oh, well, what do you do if a car doesn't start?
Well, if it doesn't start, you can just crank the engine over for at least 6 seconds and then leave the ignition on as well.
Oh, so instead of driving it, you crank the engine to make sure that the system stored all the inputs?
That's exactly right.
Oh.
Let's go ahead and do that. Crank the engine over.
Okay, now I didn't turn the ignition off.
Okay, now we need to take this fuse and put it in the top of the fuel pump relay for at least 4 seconds.
Oh yeah, that's just like the turbo in the 4000.
Just the same. And then after 4 seconds, remove the fuse.
Oh yeah, the light's starting to flash now.
That's right. Take a look at the number of sequences that it's flashing. What do you read?
Okay. It looks like 4444.
Okay, take a look at the book there inside the car and see what that sequence means, because that's the fault code.
It says here, no fault stored in memory.
All right, what that's telling us is that there are no faults stored in the ignition system memory. So what we'll need to do then is to go on and check the second part of the memory. You see, the memory stores faults in both the ignition system and fuel system memories.
Will this code keep repeating itself like on a turbo?
Yeah, at the end of every sequence of flashes, you'll see it'll come on and stay on and then go out, and then it'll repeat the code again until we go on to the next step.
Oh, that's a 2.5 second pause to indicate that it's ending its display and about to begin another one.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Just like the turbo.
Yeah. Okay, let's put the fuse in and go on to the next step then. So I'll put the fuse in for 4 seconds again, and then take it out, and we should get the display.
Yeah, there's our 2.5 second pause.
Okay, now what's it doing?
Well, it just keeps going out and coming back on again for, it looks like about 2, maybe 3 seconds.
Okay, it should do that. That's an indication that we've reached the end of this first test, so that there are no faults stored in that memory. That's the 0000 display.
Oh, that's 000? That's different than on the turbo.
That sure is. But what this is an indication of is, once again, that we're checking the first part of the memory, and now we're ready to start checking the second part. So if we put the fuse back in for 4 seconds into the fuel pump relay, we can begin our checks on the fuel system memory.
All right, okay. Okay, there's our 2.5 second pause saying it's about to begin. 1, 2, 1, 2,
Okay, what was the display this time?
2122, which the book says engine speed signal or hall sender signal.
Okay, and that may be the problem which is causing the car not to start. Now what we'll do is we'll put the fuse back in, and we'll see if there's any other fault codes stored in the memory.
Okay, now it's showing 000 again. 0000 rather, 4 zeros.
Okay, so that tells us we've come to the end of our test. So we've gone through then both halves of the fault memory check. We went through the ignition system check, and at the end of that we got the 4 zeros. Now we've gone through the fuel system checks, and now we've gotten the 4 zeros again. That tells us we've completed our input checks for the fuel and ignition systems.
Oh, so now I guess we got to go and find out why it's not getting the Hall signal.
That's right. That's the next part of our troubleshooting.
All right.
Now that we've finished making all the input checks for the fuel system and the ignition system, let's make the output checks. Take a look in the book and let's see what those checks are.
Well, it says here there's 4 components that we're going to check. The differential pressure regulator, the carbon canister shutoff solenoid, the idle stabilizer valve, and the cold start valve.
It should look a little bit familiar.
Yeah, it looks pretty similar to the turbo. Some of the components are different, but I see it displays a code as well as operating a component.
Well, let's find out how we make this check. For this one, it's a little bit different. We need to insert the fuse in the top of the relay before we turn the ignition on. That's how the control unit knows that we're making output checks and not input checks.
Oh, that's similar to a turbo.
All right, now, once the fuse is in, let's turn the ignition on and leave the fuse in for at least 4 seconds. And then at the end of 4 seconds, we'll take the fuse out, and a couple things should happen. We should see a display on the dash that is the sequence of lights that you see in the book there.
Okay, the code says 4341, and that's to indicate that the system's generating that output signal like on a turbo?
Right, and the second thing we need to do now is to make sure that the first component is in fact getting that signal and is working. So we do that by pressing the full throttle switch.
Oh, that's different.
Right, so close the full throttle switch and let's see what happens.
The milliamp meter that we hooked up to the differential pressure regulator goes from 100 milliamps to about 10 milliamps, 9.9 or something like that.
And according to the book, that's the specification we should have. So that
Okay.
tells us that that part of the system is working, that the output is being generated by the control unit, and that the differential pressure regulator is responding.
Okay, all right.
All right, to go on to the next step, we put the fuse back in for another 4 seconds.
And that switches the system to the next step.
Right, goes to the next step, and inside we should see the display that you've got in the book for our second output check.
Okay, once it goes to the next step, when you pull the fuse out, it starts displaying the code 4343.
That's right, and what component is that checking?
Carbon canister shutoff solenoid over there.
Okay, it should click when we push the full throttle switch again.
All right, well,
So let's do that.
Okay. All right, yeah, I hear it. Okay, there it goes.
Okay. To get on to the next step then, we put the fuse back in.
And now we're going to go, it says here, to the idle stabilizer valve.
Right, we should hear it click, and we should also see the code displayed.
Code's 4431.
Okay, let's see what happens. Take the fuse back out.
Oh, yeah, there it is. You can hear it.
Okay.
All right.
So what we'll do is we'll just continue on and make the final checks then. Put the fuse back in.
It says the last one here is the cold start valve with a code of 4443. It also says, oh yeah, this is just like a turbo. It says the cold start valve is only going to operate for 10 seconds.
Right, why do you think it's doing that?
So it doesn't flood the engine.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Okay, go ahead and depress the full throttle switch then.
Okay, there it goes. I can hear it ticking.
Okay. One thing now that you're going to find is when we get to the end of this test sequence, it's a little bit different than the input checks. What happened at the end of the input checks?
And we got that 2.5-second pause that indicated the code of 4 zeros.
This one's a little different. You're not going to get that. You're going to get this final display that we just saw, or that we'll see on the instrument panel, and that'll be all. That'll tell us that we're at the end of this test.
Okay, and if we trigger it to the next step, the light just goes blank. It doesn't come on.
Right.
Okay, let me see if I got this straight. Drive the car for at least 5 minutes or crank the starter for 6 seconds. Leave the ignition on. Insert the fuse in the fuel pump relay for at least 4 seconds. And then reinsert it to switch to the next step. And I do this till I complete the ignition and the fuel system input test to get 0, 0, 0, 0.
And for the output checks, turn the ignition off, reinsert the fuse, turn the ignition on, close the full throttle switch to activate the component, remove and reinsert the fuse to move from step to step. And don't forget, it's always a good idea to have a piece of paper handy so that you can write down all the codes. Hey, Mark, what do you got, a radio problem?
Yeah, I got a customer complaint here on poor radio reception.
Oh, really? I've had a few of those myself. Those can sometimes be tough to find.
Yeah, sometimes they are hard to track down. There's a couple things I always try to check, though, before I replace the radio. The first thing is I check, make sure I got good connections back here, my power and ground on this gang plug.
Right.
Check the speaker connections, make sure they're tight, make sure they're in the right holes. And also check the antenna lead, make sure that's tight.
You know, I've had problems that the customer complains about the radio cutting out when he hits the brake pedal or is operating the intermittent wipers.
That is strange. I had a couple of those, too. It just cuts out for a brief minute, like when
Right.
he steps on the brake pedal or whenever the wipers pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you do for that?
Well, I fixed a couple of them by putting an extra ground strap from the radio chassis itself,
Right.
an additional ground strap,
Uh-huh.
bolted to the radio chassis and bolt the other end to a good vehicle ground back here behind the console.
Yeah, I guess all the grounds on the car are pretty important too, aren't they?
Yeah, you want to make sure that the alternator ground, too, is good. That can cause interference. I look at the alternator, and if it doesn't already have an external ground strap, I'll put one on.
Do you have like a system that you use besides just checking the radio? Is there anything else that you check usually?
Yeah, well, first I check the radio connections, and I'll check the ground strap on the antenna, like I said, or the ground strap on the alternator, and then I'll go back and check the antenna.
You know, one thing I found too is this DX button is pretty important.
Yeah.
A lot of customers just leave the DX on all the time.
Yeah.
And what that does is that allows you to pick up stations when you're further away from the transmitter.
Right, yeah.
But when you get close to the transmitter, if this button is still in, that causes a lot of reception problems.
It does?
Yes, so one thing I usually do when I'm checking these things out is to try pushing that button and see if that changes the reception any. You also said that you have problems with the antenna sometime?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple things you can check there, too. Come on back and I'll show you.
Okay. Well, what are some of the things you look for back here?
Well, the first thing I'll check is to make sure that the antenna is mounted good and tight, because that's where the antenna gets its ground, is from this clamping piece or this mounting piece underneath on the mast here. So I want to make sure that the antenna is tight and that mounting piece underneath there is clean, there's no rust or anything that could cause a resistance.
So like you said earlier, the grounds are really important then.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there any way that you can check the cable, the antenna lead from back here all the way to the radio?
Oh, you mean the cable that goes from the antenna right back to the radio? I've tried a couple times and I never can get a reading on my own meter. And I've heard that there's a capacitor in that lead, so the only real way you can test it is to substitute another one and see if that makes a difference.
Okay. How about checking the amplifier? Is there any way we can check that?
Well, that's really important now that all Audis come with this shortened amplifier, or shortened antenna with the amplifier on it. The only real way to check that is to disconnect the power supply to the amp. You can go down here and pull the power wire off the amp, because that's where the amp is, right here at the base of the antenna.
Okay.
Turn the radio on first, then pull the wire off. And when you pull the wire off, you hear the reception. It should become real poor. And when you stick the wire back on, the reception should be restored back to its previous value. You know, you should hear a real distinct difference in the radio quality when you pull the wire on and off. If you don't hear that difference, then check and make sure that there's a 12-volt, a battery voltage supply at that lead.
Right.
If it's there and you still don't get the difference when you pull the power supply wire off and on, then obviously the amp and the antenna's faulted.
Yes.
You have to replace the whole antenna.
Okay. You know, something else I found on these cars is that the speakers are very important. Why don't you come over here for just a minute? Let me show you the car I'm working on.
All right.
Now, the car I'm working on here has got the 10-speaker sound system.
Uh-huh.
You'll notice we've got the 2 speakers here in the door, the woofer and the tweeter. We've also got this mid-range speaker up here in the dash.
Oh.
Now, these 3 speakers work in conjunction with this crossover network. So the signals come out of the radio into the crossover network, and then the crossover network decides which of the 3 speakers can best handle the frequencies, and that's where it directs them.
Oh, so there must be one of these in each front door then.
There's one in this door, and there's one in the other front door. All cars with the 10-speaker system will have that.
Oh.
Now, the back speakers are being controlled by a booster amplifier that's in the trunk underneath the hatch shelf on the left-hand side next to the speaker.
Uh-huh.
So if you're checking out the rear speakers or the speakers in the rear doors, make sure that you check the wire connectors on that booster amplifier.
Oh, so that booster amplifier runs these rear speakers in the hatch shelf plus the speakers in the rear doors?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one time I had a car where the rear speakers didn't work, and I started taking one of the rear speakers out and taking all this stuff apart, and I found out all it was just the on-off switch on the headphone jack was turned off.
Yeah, a similar thing happened to me because I had a car without the rear speakers working, and it turns out that the fuse for the booster amplifier is under the back seat on the left-hand side. There's a little fuse holder there.
It has a separate fuse.
That's right, so you want to make sure you check that fuse as well.
Well, the other day I had a Quattro wagon in it, and that had the 10-speaker system. That doesn't have a rear hatch shelf, so where's the booster on that?
You're going to find that booster is also located under the back seat, right next to that fuse holder.
Oh, that's why I didn't see it. Okay. All right. Well, so far we've covered radios, we've covered antennas. You told me about this 10-speaker sound system. Well, what do you do when you get a complaint on the tape deck?
Well, let's go look at that car that you're working on with the cassette player.
All right. The two complaints that I receive most often on these tape players is the poor sound quality, and the other one is when they just eat the tape.
Yeah, a lot of those problems are caused because the inside of the tape player is dirty. And that's caused because a lot of the residue from the tape itself can build up on the tape head and on the capstan and on the rollers.
Oh.
So what you need to do is use some type of cleaner. Now what we've got is this wet cleaner, which works pretty well. And what you need to do is use a little of this solvent and just wet it down, and then install the cassette in the player. Now make sure when you do it too that you leave it in there to run for a while, and then push the program button.
Why?
Well, this is an auto reverse deck, so what we need to do is clean the second capstan and clean the second roller.
Oh, because it goes both directions,
That's
so it has
right.
two sets. All right, that makes sense.
So if you take a look at what we've done here,
Well, look at all the junk on there.
that's right, and this is one way to try to eliminate that problem.
Well, where'd all that stuff come from?
Well, once again, that's all the residue that's inside from the tape, and it all collects in there, and that's why you get distortion sometimes, or that's why the tape will just spit out the front. Now, on some of these too, I found they get so dirty that you really just can't clean them with this. So what you'll have to do then is take the radio out and send it in and have a professional take it apart, go inside, and clean it out good.
Okay, well, what about the other type of cleaners? You know, that I've seen some that have like they're a cassette, but they have an abrasive strip running across here, and then there's others that come with Q-tips and solvent like this.
Yeah, you've got to be careful about those kinds of things. For one thing, this kind of player, when the tape goes in, it drops down. So if you try to use a Q-tip or anything to clean it out, you're really not going to do very good because you can't get in there to get the dirt and the residue off of it.
Yeah. Well, this probably wouldn't be bad for the customer to know either, because they should keep their tapes clean as well.
That's right. And another important thing is that the tape should be stored. In other words, you shouldn't leave them laying out, laying in the sun or anywhere else where they can collect a lot of dirt.
Oh.
So clean tapes are really important.
Well, that makes sense. All right, well, thanks a lot for the tips.
Okay.
Remember, for the radio, check connections. Check the grounds. If necessary, add a ground. For the antenna, check grounds again.